Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. The Puja Khedkar issue has raised serious and worrying questions about the functioning of the Union Public Service Commission. In an article that he wrote for the Calcutta newspaper on Friday, my guest has discussed those concerns and he joins me today to share his thinking and hopefully to elaborate on it. I'm delighted to be joined by India's former ambassador to Myanmar, Afghanistan, and Thailand, and a former senior secretary to the government of India, Vivek Katju. Mr. Katju, in an op-ed you wrote for the Calcutta paper, The Telegraph, on Friday, you raised certain critical concerns about the Union Public Service Commission, which I would like to discuss with you today. But first, you also raised two issues about the Puja Khedkar case, and let me start with that. You say the UPSC's own investigation shows that Puja Khedkar fraudulently availed of attempts to sit the UPSC exam beyond the permissible limit by faking her identity by changing her name, her father and mother's name, her photograph and signature, her email ID, mobile number, and address. Why was this not detected earlier? Why was it only found out afterwards?
Well, that is a question that the UPSC will have to answer. Uh, they have said in their press notes that hers is the only case that they've detected over the last 15 years or so. And that she was able to do so because she changed everything, all the particulars. And hence, the inference is that their standard operating procedures were unable to detect this. They've also said that they are in the process of strengthening those standard operating procedures. Now, Karan, if you allow me a minute to elaborate, the UPSC conducts the civil services examination in two stages. The first stage is the preliminary stage. Those who clear the preliminary stage sit for main examination. It is at the stage of the candidates who succeed for the main examination that the UPSC asks them to fill a detailed application form. And in this application form, they are expected to load scanned copies of all the eligibility documents that they have: education, quotas, disabilities, etc. Uh, my impression is, at least it was when I was appearing for this exam and I was a candidate, that those from the main examination who qualify for the interview are expected to bring original copies, which are then matched with the scanned copies. So, as the UPSC says, that they can only carry out a preliminary verification of these documents, and they have, as I've noted in my article, passed the buck on to the government. They say there are other authorities that are mandated to look at the genuineness of these documents.
Let me ask you this. The UPSC standard operating procedures, as you said, do not have the capacity to verify all the documents given. So, is it the case that the UPSC would be paralyzed if it had to verify documents presented by lakhs and lakhs of candidates before permitting them to do the exam? In other words, it doesn't have, or more correctly, it cannot have a system for verifying this, which is why it leaves it to the government to do so.
I think uh, this requires another clarification. The UPSC is only an examining body. It is a recommendatory body. The appointing organizations are the organizations of government, what are called the cadre controlling authorities, after they receive the UPSC recommendations on the basis of the examinations they conduct. It seems to me, from the press notes that the UPSC has put out, that they do what they say a preliminary examination, that we see match the scanned copies with the originals, etc., and that we are not in a position to go further, and that there are others. Now, quite clearly, if there are thousands of documents, then as an examining body, They say they don't have the mandate to do so, and nor do they have the wherewithal. And I can see their
But
problem.
this then means, Mr. Katju, that we don't know how many people have gamed the system in this way. It's only when they're caught that we find out. But if they're not caught, we would never know.
Well, this brings me to the essential point, which is that once the government receives the UPSC's recommendations, then it always carries out what is called a police verification. And second, it looks at the genuineness of the medical certificates. The medical certificates are given by authorized hospitals or medical
Let's come
institutions.
to the medical issue separately. That is the second
Okay,
concern about Puja
okay,
Khedkar.
okay.
Concentrate for now on what you wrote about in your article, that she gamed the system by faking her identity, by changing her name, her father and mother's name, her photograph and signature, her email ID, mobile number, and address. And what we're establishing is that the UPSC on its own does not have a system by which it can verify these details. It leaves it to the government to do so at a later stage, which means that we don't know how many people have successfully gamed the system in this way. We only find out when they get caught out, but if they're not caught out, we don't find out.
Well, two things there. First, the UPSC has looked at the Puja Khedkar case in a very narrow sense, in the sense that they've said she gamed the system to get more attempts than she was entitled to as a candidate,
And
and
succeeded. And
and
succeeded.
succeeded. But they've also added that we've examined all the previous documents over the last 15 years or whatever, and they've said that only hers is the only case that we've been able to detect. So
There
in
we
that,
have there we have their word for it. The truth is, we don't know how many people have got away by gaming the system. It's only when they're caught that we find out. There are others who may not have been caught, and we would not know. That
well,
is an established point, isn't it?
that is a problem. As a former civil servant, I would say that, and as a citizen, I would say that is a genuine problem with all kind of malfeasance or crime, etc. That people get away with it, some people are caught. So I
Absolutely.
think I
I take your point. But it's particularly worrying when people can get away potentially with this sort of malfeasance in the case of the UPSC exams, which are critical to the formation of our civil services. Let's come at this point to the second issue connected with Puja Khedkar. It's after she passed the examination and the government required her medical examination to verify her claimed disabilities. Reports suggest that she was on 6 different occasions ordered to go to the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, but refused to do so. Instead, she provided a certificate from some other source which the government accepted. You believe the government needs to explain on what basis this alternate certificate was accepted. Why does the government need to explain that?
because it's a very serious issue, and it's an issue that concerns the government itself. And further, they appointed an additional secretary to look into this matter. And the press report suggests that the additional secretary has submitted a report. So I think the people of India deserve to know that how did she gain the medical certificate? Because quite clearly the suspicion is that she also succeeded in gaming her physical disability certificate, and certainly the fact that she didn't appear 6 times, if these reports are correct, and we'll only get to know that if the additional secretary's report is brought out in the public
Let's
domain.
take this step by step. If it
Okay.
is the case that on 6 separate occasions she was ordered to go to AIMS to get herself medically checked and refused to do so, how unusual, how exceptional would that refusal on her part be?
I think very, very unusual because normally and I've checked this with my colleagues, uh, who and all of us, I mean, my colleagues who've been civil servants, is normally what happens is that the UPSC arranges the medical examination. I stress the word arranges. So after you've appeared in the interview, and only those candidates go for medical examination who are called for the interview. So after you've done your interview, the UPSC instructs you to go to a particular hospital or medical institution for a medical test, and that would also apply to people with benchmark disabilities. So
And
the
she was
UPSC,
there, and she was therefore expected to obey the instructions and go to the AIMS for her checkup.
I will I would think that if the UPSC instructed her, she should have gone. Now there can be cases where a person cannot go. Now the UPSC, after it has conducted its examinations and it issues its recommendations publicly, thereafter the ball is in the court of the government,
Now,
and
we'll
that is
come to the
why.
government in a moment's time. The first thing is, on 6 separate occasions, reports say she was instructed to go to AIMS and didn't go, refused to go. That you're saying is extremely unusual and exceptional. Yes, am I right?
Yes, and also uh, it is my understanding that could have owned those instructions after the first UPSC instruction. Those instructions would have gone from the Department of Personnel, because the Department of Personnel is the body in the government which liaises with the UPSC and which is nodal for for
Secondly,
appointments.
Secondly, after refusing to go to AIMS on 6 separate occasions, as is reported, how unusual is it that the government would then accept an alternate certificate from another hospital? How unusual is that?
It is mystifying, and that is why I have urged that this mystery can only be cleared if the additional secretary's report is made public, and if it is made public, then we will get to know whether in earlier cases they've been, and that means that there have been precedents where candidates
Let's come to the additional secretary's report. The additional secretary carried out an inquiry which presumably would have gone into this specific issue of why she didn't go to AIMS when ordered on 6 occasions to do so, and why the government accepted an alternate certificate from another hospital. You write, and I'm quoting from your article, this issue cannot be buried under the carpet. The government has to come clean on this issue. In other words, the additional secretary's inquiry must be made public. Am I right? It must be made public.
That is my belief. It is my strong belief that it should be made public, because uh, we should know what the additional secretary's findings are.
Tell me this.
It is
What?
just as Karan, one sentence here. Just as the UPSC has come clean on this and has stated that we conducted an inquiry and this is what our inquiry reveals, and therefore we've cancelled her candidature, and any in she can't be a candidate for future examinations. Now, it can't be the government's case that because her candidature has fallen and she can't be an IAS officer, therefore this matter is over. No, we need to know how was it that, if at all, that she gained the physical examination system that the government has, and what are the standard operating procedures for the
Tell me
government.
this. What would be your suspicion if the government refuses to make the additional secretary's report public and therefore refuses to come clean on this issue? What would be your suspicion if that is the case?
Well, in the public mind, when such reports are not made public, the normal suspicions are that is someone being shielded? Is there a systemic problem that the government needs to address and the government is aware of? Now, this is not a political question,
Now,
it's
let
an
me stop you
administrative
there.
question.
Let me stop you there. You're saying that if the government refuses to go public with the additional secretary's inquiry report, two suspicions would arise. Firstly, is someone being shielded? presumably shielded by the government? And secondly, is there a wider, deeper systemic problem which is not being revealed? Both of those suspicions are worrying. It's in the government's interest and in the interest of the system that they be cleared quickly.
And in the interest of people with benchmark disabilities. It
But
is
that
in their
apart,
interest
but
too.
that apart, let's not get deflected by people with benchmark disabilities. That's a detail. It's in the interest of the UPSC system, which is critical to hiring for the civil services, that these doubts are removed. That's what
I,
you're agreeing with.
I am concerned with three things. One, I'm concerned with the system, that the entire system, uh, there should be no suspicion hanging over the system itself.
Second,
Second, I'm concerned that if such suspicions linger on, then the civil service, it impacts adversely on the civil service fraternity itself. And third, that there are genuine people, thousands of genuine persons who have who have these benchmark disabilities, and that their interests also demand, the genuine person's interests demand that they they are given a fair chance, and that others who do not have these disabilities and are not able to smuggle themselves in.
my
So
last
therefore, on
question on
all
this,
three counts.
my last question on this issue before I come to wider concerns about the UPSC that you've written about in that Telegraph article. The government is not doing itself a favor, and it's certainly not doing the UPSC system a favor by failing to reveal the additional secretary's report. Is that right?
Well, till now, the government has not revealed the UPSC, the report of the additional secretary.
And it's
It,
not doing itself a favor by refusing to do so.
I think it would be in the government's interest and the people's interest if that report is revealed.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.
Okay, let's now at this point come to three other concerns that you've mentioned in your article for the Telegraph about the UPSC itself. First of all, although this is only hinted at in your Telegraph article, you believe the UPSC is not democratic enough in its functioning. Could you explain this further? Where does it fall short?
Well, my understanding is this, and I'm only saying this is my understanding, because the UPSC functions in its own way and maintains the level of confidence, and that should be so. But my understanding is that there is the secretariat of the UPSC, and the secretariat of the UPSC only answers to the chairperson of the UPSC. And the members are allotted work by the chairperson. Therefore, and there are, I would imagine, there are uh, times in which all the members sit with the chairperson as a committee and discuss cross-cutting issues. I think that it would be preferable if if there was a greater sense of participation of members through mechanisms that the UPSC can devise itself, where all the reporting is made a little different from the way it is today of the secretariat and the relationship of the secretariat with the chairperson. So there should be a greater participation of members in the administration of the UPSC.
Let me clarify what you're saying. You're saying, first of all, that members of the UPSC, as opposed to the chairman of the UPSC, should have a greater role, a greater participation. They shouldn't simply be doing work that is allotted to them by the chairman. They should also have the capacity to take an initiative themselves. And secondly, you're saying that the secretariat should be answerable to the members, not just solely to the chairman.
Well, there can be a committee a committee of members chaired by the chairperson, and there can be certain issues where this committee itself takes a decision, and,
Okay.
the UPSC can devise its own methods.
In other words, what you're talking about is greater democratization in the functioning of the UPSC.
Yes, yes.
Secondly, you say, and I'm quoting you from your article in the Telegraph, there is no doubt that the people have enormous trust in the UPSC. This has to be preserved at all costs. In a democracy, institutions can never take public trust for granted. But you add that trust is undermined when sitting members begin to extol the virtues of government policies. How often does this happen? And can you give me an example?
Well, even one case of such a thing happening is bad enough for me.
But has it happened? What is that one case?
Well, I think it'll be improper for me to name names, but it's all over the internet. You can see that. You see, the principle.
Just hang on. Hang on. We've got to be precise. I don't want you to deflect. You're saying to me that although it would be invidious to name names, it is all over the internet that a member or several members of the UPSC have been extolling the virtues of government policies. In other words, members of the UPSC, who you are reluctant to name, have been publicly on social media extolling the virtues of government policies. That's what you're saying.
At least I've seen one case, and it's readily available in the internet. I wouldn't like to go further, but I would like to focus more on the principle.
We will come to the principle in a moment's time, but first explain this to me, because the audience will ask themselves the question, why is it wrong for members of the UPSC to extol the virtues of government policy? Can you explain that?
Yes, that is exactly what I was wanting to do by expounding on the principle. I think the principle has to be that UPSC members are not only neutral, but are manifestly neutral. And as I've mentioned in my article, that if there is a view expressed by even one member of the UPSC on a certain aspect of government policy, and a candidate then comes before the interview board, would he be comfortable if his views are different? Now, one can argue that he should have the courage of his convictions, etc. But a candidate is in a very vulnerable position. And therefore, I do believe that just as the principle is, justice must not only be done, it must be manifestly done. Hence, from that, I think this principle has to be that the UPSC is not only neutral, but it is manifestly so.
Okay.
And hence, I think it is impaired if even one member goes on the social media to discuss various issues, even if it's indirect. Because
in other words,
my last point, just allow me this last point. I think once you become a member of the UPSC, you have to lead even in these turbulent times, you have to lead a cloistered life. That is a choice you've made. And you should not express your views in public.
In other words, what people call the Caesar's wife principle must apply.
It has to be so. Otherwise, this great institution, for which I have enormous respect, I've written this article as a concerned person, as someone who went through that system. As I have colleagues who have gone through this system. I'm even using the word reverence. There is a certain reverence for the system in the public mind, that everything else can, there can be difficulties with, but the UPSC is one in which you can repose total faith. And
Okay.
my concern is that that should never be eroded.
Now, trust in the UPSC is also damaged when, and I'm quoting from you, after retirement, some UPSC members develop links with commercial coaching centers. Am I right in saying this would be a bit like judges joining law firms after retirement or army chiefs becoming directors of weapons manufacturing companies? Tell me, how often does it happen in the case of the UPSC that members, on retiring from the UPSC, develop commercial links with coaching centers?
Not very often. I know of only from press reports. Uh, I know of only two cases, and in one case, of course, there were advertisements in the press, so that was obvious. There were reports about another person, but again, as I said, one case is bad enough,
Here
and
it's two
hence,
cases. It's not one in this instance,
yes,
it's two cases.
yes, there are two cases, and that is why I believe that the UPSC itself must devise its norms of how it should, how
Can I
its
interrupt and put
members
this to
should
you?
function.
Can I interrupt and put this to you? Whether we're talking about UPSC members extolling the virtues of government policies in public or in social media, or whether we're talking about retired members of the UPSC developing links with commercial coaching centers, the one or the two that you know of are only the ones you know of. There may well be more that you don't know of. In other
Well,
words, we don't know how deep the potential rot runs.
I think these things don't remain hidden, at least in the fraternity, in the civil service fraternity, in the public, in this day of the social media, in these days of the social media, these things can't remain hidden.
Then the
So
opposite is true. Then the opposite is true. If this problem is not nipped in the bud pretty quickly, it could proliferate.
uh, I think you put it well. I think the UPSC itself has to consider this, and the UPSC must devise its mechanisms whereby its members, even after they relinquish their jobs, perform in a certain way. Now, let me add
Can I interrupt you there again? Is it the UPSC that must consider this, or is it the government that must nudge the UPSC into doing so? After all, each and every member of the UPSC is appointed by the government. Surely the onus is on the government to ensure that these infractions don't continue and get worse.
the UPSC is a very high constitutional body, and it is a very responsible body.
So it must
I have enormous respect for some persons who've held the membership of the UPSC,
okay.
and
Let me then
I think one sentence. I think they have the capacity to do all this by themselves, and that uh, they should be left to do it by themselves.
they have the capacity, they must now show the will to do it.
Indeed, they have to show the will.
Finally, you say the UPSC needs to update its eligibility conditions. Here, some of the lapses or errors that you mention in your Telegraph article are actually howlers. They're actually things that would be ludicrous, except for the fact they're true. Can you give me some examples of the sort of things you found?
You see, there is the eligibility conditions are laid out by the government. The UPSC is an examining body. Those who are those who have the eligibility conditions, as I said, are all set out by government. Now, one of the eligibility conditions is relates to nationality, and what I have mentioned is right there from page 10 of the
But give me the
UPSC's
details.
answer.
Give me the
Well,
details.
the three things I've mentioned there.
So
In
what are
addition,
they?
well, the first is it says for services other than the foreign service and the administrative service and the police, uh, Indian citizens, and in addition to Indian citizens, nationals of other countries and people of Indian origin, as well as Tibetan refugees who came to India before a certain period, are eligible to appear in these exams.
Where's the
And
problem?
no, I'm coming to that. And that they have to get an eligibility certificate from the government. Now, what is the problem? First, as I mentioned, instead of national of Nepal, they mention subject of Nepal. Now, anyone reading
Hang
that,
on. The line broke at that point. You're saying instead of mentioning nationals of Nepal, they mention subjects of Nepal. Subjects, you say, applies to a monarchy. Nepal hasn't been a monarchy since 2008.
that's right. So it should have been updated. Now, UPSC demands excellence of uh, of the candidates, and therefore, even if this comes from the government, the UPSC must stick its heels in, dig its heels in, and say, look, we will not go.
What is the second example?
Second example is calling Myanmar Burma. If a candidate were to call it in an interview, were to refer to Myanmar as Burma, how will he score great marks?
Aung San Suu Kyi always called Myanmar Burma.
No, but India does not consider it Burma. India now accepts the name Myanmar for it, and that is the name by which the UPSC should mention it. In this eligibility form, it can't be any other name than the name which is accepted by India as its international name.
So the
And
UPSC is using an old, outdated, and no longer relevant name for Burma. It should be calling it Myanmar instead.
absolutely, and if this is something which has come to it from government, it must go back to government and say, look, correct this.
What is the third example? What is the third example?
It says that Tibetan refugees who came to India before 1962, or words to that effect. Now, that line has to be omitted. It doesn't say children of Tibetan refugees. So, how can you have persons who are over 60 being eligible for to be candidates? So,
In
this
other
has
words,
to be removed.
in other words, you're saying what's missing is the phrase children of Tibetan refugees.
No. What I'm saying is that that is out of the phrase as it stands. The eligibility condition is totally outdated. It is for government to decide what it wants to do with Tibetan refugees, eligibility conditions, etc. But as the formulation stands, it's actually ludicrous.
Finally,
Finally,
I'm interrupting you. There's something that's not in your article, but you mentioned on the phone to me a reference to Vietnam. Can you explain what that reference is and why it's inappropriate and incorrect?
well, I think it's outdated because there is a provision for that persons of Indian origin from certain countries, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, etc., and it's Kenya, uh, Tanzania are eligible to appear for these exams, provided they get a certificate of eligibility from
Where does
the
Vietnam
government.
fit into that?
And Vietnam is also mentioned there. Now, for the life of me, I sort of couldn't understand why Vietnam is there, unless this is something that goes back to the time when Puducherry was amalgamated into the Union and the French left. Unless it goes back to that time, otherwise, people of Indian origin from Vietnam. So, what I have suggested is that the government must look at this particular eligibility criteria all over again and should do so quickly.
Okay, and the onus you're saying here rests with the government.
Yes, entirely, because the government prescribes the eligibility conditions.
Mr. Katju, thank you very much for making time for me. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you very much, Karan.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, And if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.